At dawn on November 10th, 1944, the bitter wind off the Philippine Sea whipped across the barbed wire of a makeshift American prison camp. Inside, hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war stood silent, their uniforms in tatters, their eyes sunken with hunger and disbelief. Beyond the wire, a convoy of U.S. Army trucks rolled slowly into the compound. Canvas covers lifted back. Boxes, neatly packed, labeled, wrapped, were stacked high, stamped with Red Cross insignias and handwritten American addresses. The guards barked orders, the prisoners shuffled closer, and for the first time in months, silence gave way to murmurs of astonishment. Inside those boxes lay canned peaches, tobacco, soap, socks, and letters written in neat cursive script, care packages sent not by the U.S. Army, but by ordinary American families. For the prisoners who had been trained to believe that surrender was a fate worse than death, this moment felt impossible. Some froze, others trembled, and a few wept openly, their hands hovering over gifts from the very country they had sworn to destroy. U.S. Army Prisoner Processing Log, Leyte, November 1944. The story begins not with charity, but with a brutal collision of cultures and doctrines. By late 1944, Japan's armies had been driven back across the Pacific. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were falling into American hands. Yet within Imperial Army ideology, capture was shame incarnate. The Bushido Code, twisted for wartime use, held that death was preferable to dishonor. Soldiers were instructed to fight to the last cartridge, to embrace suicide before surrender. Many units issued grenades specifically for that purpose. Surrender was not only disobedience, it was erasure from the Japanese nation itself. Imperial Army Field Manual, 1941. And yet, across the Pacific Islands, tens of thousands surrendered anyway, broken by starvation, wounds, or sheer exhaustion. American commanders, steeped in their own legal and humanitarian frameworks, treated these men under the Geneva Convention, even though Japan had never ratified it. Camps were established, records kept, and rations allotted. And within this framework emerged a peculiarity that stunned Japanese POWs. American families, hearing of the plight of captured enemies, began sending parcels addressed to any prisoner of war under U.S. custody. Tobacco companies donated cartons of cigarettes. Church groups sewed socks, and school children wrote letters. By late 1944, Red Cross warehouses in San Francisco and Seattle overflowed with packages not only for Allied prisoners held by Germany and Japan, but also, astonishingly, for Japanese soldiers held by America. American Red Cross Supply Report, December 1944. For the men behind the wire, the packages arrived like artifacts from another universe. Some prisoners had not eaten sugar in years. They opened tins of condensed milk and cried. They unwrapped bars of soap and held them like treasures. They read letters from American children who wrote things like, "We hope you come home safe to your family," and stared at them in mute confusion. To the indoctrinated Japanese mind, America was supposed to be a cruel, barbaric nation of demons, fit only for annihilation. Yet here were ordinary families, sending kindness across oceans. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division Interview, 1946. This contradiction cut deep. For many prisoners, the packages sparked shame more than gratitude. One officer wrote in his diary, later recovered by U.S. censors, "To be given gifts from the enemy is unbearable. We should be killed, not fed. Yet I eat." Bundesarchiv confiscated POW diary. Others interpreted the parcels through the lens of propaganda, suspecting tricks or psychological manipulation. And yet, the consistency of the flow and the sheer ordinariness of socks and canned fruit suggested something else, that the enemy was not only stronger, but also strangely humane. In Washington, the practice was debated fiercely. Some officials questioned why America's own civilians, enduring rationing and shortages, should provide for enemy soldiers. But the Army permitted it, citing Geneva principles and long-term strategic value. Well-fed prisoners, officials argued, worked better on labor details, caused fewer uprisings, and could one day serve as living witnesses to America's treatment, testimonies that would undercut Japanese propaganda back home. War Department Memo, January 1945. Behind these practical arguments lay something more profound. America was waging not just a war of steel and fire, but a war of values, demonstrating that its power rested not only in bombs, but in law, order, and conscience. The Japanese guards and officers captured alongside enlisted men, the humiliation deepened. In their society, to be cared for by civilians of the enemy weighs an unbearable dishonor. Some refused the packages outright, leaving them untouched until they rotted. Others hoarded them in silence, unwilling to be seen enjoying what was meant as kindness. Yet for the common soldier, who had trudged through malaria-ridden jungles or starved on island garrisons, the gift of soap or tobacco was no small mercy. It was a lifeline. Archival interviews after the war reveal the psychological fracture these packages created. Some prisoners described the moment as their first realization that Japan might not win. "If even the enemy's children send us food," one recalled, "it means they are too rich, too generous. We cannot fight such people." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, POW Interrogation, 1946. Another remembered that a single tin of peaches convinced him that American abundance was endless, while Japanese soldiers were dying off beriberi on New Guinea. The paradox spread beyond the barbed wire. American guards watched the prisoners' confusion and carried the stories home. Newspapers printed features about schoolchildren sending Christmas gifts to Japanese prisoners. It became a quiet, almost forgotten subplot of the war, an empire collapsing, its warriors broken, being fed by the families of the nation that had firebombed their cities. The contradiction was staggering, and it was meant to be. America had learned from Germany's mistakes in the First World War. Mistreatment of prisoners could radicalize enemies for generations. Humane treatment could plant doubt, break morale, and serve as propaganda of its own. Yet inside the camps, the contradictions festered. Some prisoners broke down, muttering that they could never face their families again if word reached Japan that they had eaten the enemy's food. Others formed tiny circles of solidarity, hiding packages from officers and sharing them only at night, whispering like thieves in the dark. For them, kindness had become contraband, and still, the packages kept coming. Winter coats, candy, letters with photographs of smiling American families in front of clapboard houses. Some prisoners kept the photos long after the war, hidden deep in pockets as secret proof that the enemy was not what Tokyo had said. One captured naval aviator, years later, admitted that the package he received in 1945 was the first moment he doubted the emperor's divinity. U.S. Naval Intelligence Interrogation Report, 1946. By the spring of 1945, as Okinawa burned and Tokyo lay in ruins, the quiet shipments of mercy continued. Not enough to save lives in bulk, but enough to sow dissonance in minds trained only for obedience and death. For the United States, this was not just generosity. It was psychological warfare through compassion. The story of those packages is not one of simple charity. It is a tale of weaponized kindness, of humanitarian impulses serving a grand strategy. It was food, clothing, and comfort, and it was also a mirror held up to the prisoners, showing them that the America they were taught to hate was far stronger, stranger, and more humane than they imagined. And as the war ground on, those boxes would spark questions inside the barbed wire that no officer could answer. Questions that gnawed at the heart of surrender itself. Questions that, in the decisive months to come, would matter more than any bullet, because behind the next gate and the next shipment lay the secret factor that made such gestures possible. The immense machinery of American logistics, production, and communication, a hidden weapon that Japan's warriors would come to fear more than firebombs. On March 4, 1945, a Red Cross cargo vessel unloaded at San Francisco's Pier 35. Crates marked with stencils, "For prisoners of war," were hoisted onto trucks under military police supervision. Inside were thousands of packages destined for U.S.-run camps across the Pacific and continental America. Each box was a puzzle of abundance. Tins of corned beef, canned fruit, cigarettes, cocoa, wool socks, and even carefully folded letters from strangers. These shipments did not happen by accident. They were the product of one of America's most overlooked wartime advantages: its logistics network, its industrial machine, and its mastery of communication across oceans. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, March 1945. While Japanese POWs marveled at these parcels, Their true astonishment was born of something deeper, the realization that America could even afford to send such things. Japan, by 1945, was starving its own civilians, rationing rice by ounces. Factories were shattered, shipping strangled by submarine blockade. Soldiers at the front often received nothing more than a handful of millet or dried sweet potato for days. To a man who had marched barefoot through Burma, a tin of American peaches was not just food. It was proof of an enemy supply chain beyond imagination. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Civilian Nutrition Study, 1946. The hidden factor was not sentiment. It was the system that made sentiment possible. From the Detroit Arsenal, where tanks rolled off assembly lines, to the sprawling plants of General Foods, Heinz, and Libby's that packed millions of cans, to the motor convoys that stitched America's railways to its ports. The U.S. had perfected industrial war. By 1944, American factories were producing 100,000 tons of canned food per month specifically for military distribution. A fraction of that output, repurposed, could supply prisoners with luxuries unimaginable in Axis supply chains. Quartermaster General Production Figures, 1944. Even the radios that coordinated shipments told a story of technological supremacy. Motorola's FM radios, first fielded in 1941, ensured that convoys moved with precision. Quartermaster trucks could coordinate by voice over miles, something the Japanese army could not duplicate, relying still on hand signals and runners. A convoy carrying POW parcels across California highways was backed by the same radio net that directed divisions across Europe and the Pacific. The prisoners receiving those parcels were not just tasting food, they were tasting the fruits of a communication revolution. Technical Manual TM-11 to 406, 1943. Japanese reports captured after the war revealed disbelief. In one dramatized composite, a former naval officer recalled asking an American guard how such packages were possible. The guard, half amused, answered simply, "Because back home, everyone has something to give." The officer noted bitterly, "We fight with the strength of one emperor. They fight with the strength of millions of homes." Naval prisoner interrogation, Guam, August 1945. The technical depth of these shipments went further still. Cans of fruit cocktail, for example, were sealed in tin coated with enamel, designed to resist spoilage for years in the Pacific humidity. Soap bars were pressed in factories using industrial molds capable of producing tens of thousands daily. Cigarettes arrived in cardboard cartons designed for shipping endurance. Even the cardboard itself came from pulp mills running at wartime capacity, optimized for mass distribution. Every item reflected layers of engineering invisible to the prisoner opening the box, but obvious to anyone tracing the supply line. Office of War Production Circular, 1943. One decisive moment where these systems revealed their power came in the Battle of Leyte. Late 1944. As General MacArthur's forces stormed ashore, thousands of Japanese defenders were cut off from supply. They survived on roots, coconuts, and the occasional sack of rice smuggled by sea. Those captured were skeletal, riddled with disease, and barely clothed. In stark contrast, U.S. supply convoys unloaded daily onto Leyte's beaches not only ammunition and rations but also even comfort items like candy and cigarettes. When these prisoners, captured in jungles, were marched to processing camps, they witnessed American soldiers opening tins of Spam and sharing chocolate. Weeks later, when the first Red Cross parcels reached their barracks, the effect was explosive. Men who had fought to the last breath suddenly realized that America could project abundance across oceans, while Japan could not even sustain its garrisons 100 miles from home. Leyte Processing Camp Report, November 1944. From the enemy's perspective, the humiliation cut deep. Diaries and interrogations showed Japanese officers insisting the packages were psychological warfare designed to break their spirit. They were not entirely wrong. U.S. military psychologists documented prisoner reactions carefully. They noted heightened depression among officers, confusion among enlisted men, and, in some cases, ideological cracks. One report recorded prisoners comparing American abundance to the shortages in Tokyo, concluding, "We were fools to believe victory possible." U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Branch. February 1945. The hidden advantage lay not only in material goods but also in the ability to mobilize civilian participation. America's home front was wired into the war effort like no other. Churches, schools, and civic organizations, each was encouraged to contribute. The Red Cross became a logistical clearinghouse, with warehouses across the United States filled by donations funneled through train networks. Engineers at refrigeration companies designed insulated containers to preserve perishables during shipping. Dock workers in Oakland, Seattle, and Los Angeles loaded parcels alongside munitions. Every layer of American society participated in this cycle, a fact that Japanese prisoners could scarcely comprehend. American Red Cross National Report. 1945, the contrast with Axis supply systems was devastating. Germany, under bombing siege, rationed its prisoners harshly, often to the brink of starvation. Japan, never having signed the Geneva Convention, treated Allied captives with notorious cruelty. Prisoners on the Burma Railway were beaten, starved, and worked to death. For Japanese POWs, to receive parcels from their enemies was not only a contradiction but also a revelation of systemic failure. Japan had nothing similar to offer, not even to its own men. International Red Cross War Crimes Report, 1946. This technical edge extended even to the smallest details. Letters included in packages were vetted by censors, copied, and sometimes translated to ensure no hidden codes. Yet their emotional power was untouched. A package with a photograph of a smiling American family in Kansas could cross the Pacific faster than a Japanese supply convoy could reach an island garrison. The logistics of compassion outran the logistics of conquest. Office of Censorship Records, 1944. By April 1945, prisoner testimonies reveal that the packages had become a central talking point in camps from Guam to Hawaii. Some men began trading parcels like currency, while others refused them in despair. Yet across the wire, guards recorded a subtle change. Discipline softened, morale fractured, and prisoners began asking quiet questions about life in America. Was it really possible that every family had food, cars, and radios? Was it really true that the enemy could afford generosity in the middle of a global war? Camp Guard Report, April 1945. And as the war's decisive battles loomed, the packages became something more than charity. They became evidence. Every can, every sock, and every letter carried an unspoken message. America had already won. Its factories, its railroads, its families, all outproduced, outlasted, and outperformed the empire of Japan. Yet this revelation was not the end of the story. For those inside the wire, kindness bred questions. For those outside, it bred strategy. The weapon of abundance had shattered illusions, but what it left in its place was a deeper psychological wound, one that would shape both the surrender and the post-war reckoning. And in the aftermath of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Japan's collapse, these parcels would take on a new meaning, not just as supplies, but as the first seeds of a legacy that would redefine war itself. By August 1945. As the fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki faded into radioactive silence, the war was over. Yet in the barbed wire compounds scattered across the Pacific and the American mainland, the story of the parcels lingered. Thousands of Japanese prisoners, broken and bewildered, now faced a future they had never imagined: survival, captivity, and return to a homeland in ruins. For them, the packages were not just food or clothing. They had become psychological milestones, reminders that the enemy they had sworn to destroy had treated them with a strange, unshakable humanity. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Morale Division. 1946. The strategic impact of these parcels cannot be overstated. American planners understood early that humane treatment of prisoners was more than morality, it was strategy. Well-fed prisoners meant fewer uprisings, fewer guards tied down, and more productive labor forces for camp maintenance and agricultural projects. In Hawaii, POWs were deployed to harvest sugarcane fields, their energy sustained partly by the very parcels donated by civilians. In California, they repaired roads and built infrastructure, guarded not by chains but by rations. The system worked. By the end of 1945, POW camps in the United States reported escape attempts at rates less than one-fifth those of German camps in Europe. U.S. Army Provost Marshal Report, December 1945, but beyond logistics lay psychology. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated to believe that Americans were cruel barbarians. Yet here they were, opening boxes filled with wool socks knitted by churchwomen in Ohio or cookies baked in Oregon. This produced what U.S. interrogators later described as cognitive dissonance of the highest order. A captured officer confessed that he had dreamed of being executed after capture, but instead received blankets and tobacco. It was as if the world itself was upside down, he admitted. POW interrogation file, Tokyo, October 1945. For the Axis powers, this was devastating. Reports compiled from post-war interrogations reveal that prisoners who had received packages often became informal ambassadors of American abundance upon their return. They spoke of factories that produced endlessly, of families that could send food even during war, and of children who wrote letters to the enemy. These stories, whispered across ruined Japan, helped erode what little faith remained in militarist ideology. It was a subtle but significant form of psychological warfare, one that endured long after the shooting stopped. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Psychological Warfare Report, 1946. The engineers and workers who made this possible rarely received credit, but they were as crucial as any soldier. The tin can manufacturers of Chicago, the pulp mill workers in Maine, and the Red Cross volunteers in San Francisco, all were participants in this hidden front. Without them, the parcels could not exist. A bar of soap in a prisoner's hands traced back to chemical engineers at Procter & Gamble optimizing wartime production lines. A pack of Lucky Strikes traced back to tobacco processors in North Carolina working under government contracts. These were not small luxuries. They were the visible tips of an industrial iceberg. Proof that America's civilian economy had not only survived, but thrived under total war. War Production Board records. 1945. Meanwhile, Japanese officers confronted a different legacy. In post-war interrogations, many admitted that the parcels shattered their self-image more than defeat on the battlefield. One dramatized composite statement captured the mood. To be defeated in combat is one thing. To be pitted by the enemy's women and children is worse than death. U.S. Army Interrogation Summary, 1946. That humiliation cut deeper than surrender. It left scars that would ripple through Japan's officer corps for decades. Yet for ordinary soldiers, the impact was strangely redemptive. Some wrote in memoirs that the parcels represented their first step toward reconciling with defeat. One former infantryman recalled that a photograph, tucked inside a package, a smiling American family with 2 boys and a dog, reminded him of his own wife and child in Tokyo. I realized then, he wrote years later, that the enemy were also fathers and mothers. The war ended for me that day. Japanese POW memoir, published 1957. Strategically, America had demonstrated something profound, that moral strength could reinforce material strength. The parcels proved to the world, and to the prisoners themselves, that the U.S. was fighting not just with bombs and bullets, but with ideals. It was a lesson that carried forward into the Cold War. During the Berlin airlift of 1948, American pilots dropped not only coal and flour but also candy bars tied to parachutes. The gesture echoed the POW parcels, weaponizing kindness once again to sway hearts and minds. U.S. Air Force Historical Office, 1949. The psychological dimension would evolve through later wars. In Vietnam, American doctrine often emphasized the hearts and minds approach, though with mixed results. In the Gulf War of 1991, coalition forces broadcast promises of humane treatment to encourage Iraqi surrenders, invoking the legacy of earlier prisoner management. In each case, the precedent traced back to World War II. The recognition that compassion, when paired with overwhelming power, could be as decisive as firepower itself. Department of Defense Psychological Operations Review, 1992. Yet it is essential to remember the human cost behind this story. For every prisoner who received a parcel, countless Allied captives under Japanese control starved, were beaten, or died building railroads in Burma. The asymmetry was staggering. America's generosity stood in brutal contrast to Japanese cruelty. And perhaps it was that contrast that made the parcels so powerful. They highlighted, with every can of peaches or bar of soap, the chasm between 2 visions of war. one rooted in annihilation, the other in law and conscience. International Red Cross Report on POW Treatment, 1947. The legacy of those boxes is therefore twofold. For the United States, they became quiet proof of industrial abundance and moral purpose. For Japan, they became a haunting reminder of defeat, not only military but civilizational. To be fed by the enemy was to admit not just loss, but inadequacy. And yet, in the long shadow of surrender, some former POWs came to see those packages as the first fragile bridges between two nations that would one day become allies in the end. The parcels symbolize a paradox of modern war. They were small, ordinary things: soap, fruit, cigarettes. Yet they carried weight greater than steel. They undermined ideology, sowed doubt, and planted seeds of reconciliation. They were acts of kindness, but also acts of strategy. And for the men who opened them, they marked the beginning of a realization that no weapon, no emperor, no code could erase, that in war, humanity itself can become the sharpest blade, as one former prisoner reflected decades later, his voice trembling in a Tokyo television studio. When I ate American chocolate, I knew the war was lost. But when I read the letter inside, I knew we might someday live in peace. Dramatized, in modern war, firepower may win battles. But it is compassion, industrialized and deliberate, that can reshape nations.